on behalf of Sloan, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's launch ceremony for the Science and Literature program, honoring excellence and diversity in science writing. In a moment, you'll hear from our wonderful partners at the National Book Foundation, but first, I wanted to share a little about the Sloan Foundation. We're a New York-based philanthropy founded in 1934, and we make grants for research and education in science, technology, and economics. Tonight's event is part of our Public Understanding of Science and Technology program, so now I'm going to show you a short video about the work we do that will provide some context.
Our universe began with a bang. Then Earth formed, and life came. 3 billion years later, that life would lead to humanity. Humans developed tools and trade. They painted cave walls and told stories around a fire. This was the beginning of both science and art, of civilization. Science and technology enabled us to understand nature and to build on it. Art and the humanities allowed us to express our deepest feelings and thoughts. They were two sides of the same human impulse to survive and thrive. But as art advanced and science became more powerful and specialized, the two cultures diverged. This polarization continues to pose a fundamental challenge to modern progress. For more than 2 decades, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Program in Public Understanding of Science and Technology has worked to bridge the divide between these two cultures. We bring science and the humanities together by empowering creators, writers, directors, playwrights, and others to tell stories that inspire appreciation for scientific discovery and its multifaceted human dimension. Sloan has supported thousands of books, screenplays, tales of great breakthroughs and tragic failures, as well as the benefits and costs of such endeavors. Their stories promote progress in human knowledge, inspire the next generation, and spotlight the people often left out of the history books. Because before Neil Armstrong could take his giant leap onto the moon, there was a young woman in Virginia who did the math to put him there. As civilization continues to advance, we'll need both scientists and artists to speak a common language and meet new challenges together. Because science is a primary engine of human progress. It touches every part of life on this planet, from our food and water to our climate and health. And it results from human curiosity, benevolence, and ambition. Now, more than ever, we must support artists with a moral, human-centered imagination to portray the complex and far-reaching role of
Thank you. Among our multimedia efforts, we have an active book program that has supported over 200 published books with science themes, everything from Richard Rhodes's Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award winning The Making of the Atomic Bomb to Margot Lee Shetterly's trailblazing Hidden Figures. This year alone, we made 20 book grants and saw new books appear from Elizabeth Colbert, Carl Zimmer, Joe Handelsman, Carl Eric Fisher, and Michelle Nijhuis. We also provide science biography fellowships through a partnership with the Leon Levy Biography Center at CUNY. However, like much of society today, we are undergoing an overdue reckoning and acknowledging the need to diversify both the stories we tell and the voices of the people who tell those stories. The latter alone will often lead to the former, since as many of you know, we often write best about the subjects and the people we know best. And this is as true for science, a quintessentially human enterprise, as for any other field. In addition, despite over 2 decades of supporting plays, screenplays, and even operas with science themes, we have never before delved into fiction and poetry. So we are making history today in more ways than one. I should emphasize that we are not referring to science fiction, but to fiction about science, imaginative and original stories that engage with real science and credible and compelling scientists, be they heroes or villains. A final note, we are very good at picking winners. One of our signature programs, the Sloan Research Fellowships, is given to the most promising scientists early in their careers. To date, 53 of these Sloan Fellows have gone on to win the Nobel Prize. So our winners tonight, the remarkable authors Daisy Hernández, Linda Hogan, and Rachel Pastan, are in very good company. In staking out this exciting new territory, we could not have found a more fitting or exceptional partner than the renowned National Book Foundation. A huge thank you to Ruth Dickey, Natalie Green, and everyone at NBF, to our esteemed jury, our extraordinary 3 winners, our distinguished moderator, Saeed Jones, and our gracious host institution and longtime grantee, the Museum of the Moving Image. Now it's my honor to welcome the terrific Ruth Dickey, Executive Director of the National Book Foundation.
Thank you so much. Wow, it's so exciting to be here with all of you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first ever Science and Literature ceremony. Thank you so much, Doran, for opening the program and for that introduction to the tremendous work of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. We're so grateful for Doran's care and guidance and the Sloan Foundation's support in launching the Science and Literature program alongside us tonight. We're also grateful for their work championing hundreds of books and authors over the years through their Public Understanding Books program. Likely, most of you in this room know the National Book Foundation as the presenter of the National Book Awards, which has celebrated the best literature in America since 1950. The awards fuel our year-round work and education and public programming to reach readers, well, everywhere, online and in person, in 40 states and counting. We work with young people, teachers, parents, and caregivers to support the discovery of a lifelong passion for books. Through book-rich environments and publisher support, we've distributed over 1.6 million books to public housing communities across the country. And we continue those conversations for adults through NBF Presents, where we bring National Book Award honored authors to colleges, libraries, book festivals, and presenting venues of all kinds for topical community programming. We're thrilled to launch our newest program with all of you tonight, especially during a time when discourse around, understanding of, and engagement with science and technology feels more important than ever. The Science and Literature program identifies 3 books annually to deepen readers' understanding of science and technology with a focus on work that highlights the diversity of voices in scientific writing. These books were selected by a committee of scientific and literary experts, a group of folks who were incredibly patient and thoughtful at the work of identifying exceptional writing across genre to kick off this program while we were fine-tuning the process in real time. My heartfelt thanks to Lydia Millett, our fearless chair, and to each and every member of the committee for their time, patience, and belief in this project. Dr. Morgan Helene, Dr. Sophia Yu Noble, Margot Lee Shetterly, and Erin Yazzie. Thank you, dear committee. Will you please stand and receive a well-deserved round of applause? Thank you all so much for making this work possible, for elevating the titles we're here to celebrate tonight, and for your utmost care to connect science and technology writing with readers. Tremendous thanks are also due to Natalie Green, Senior Manager, Public Programs. I know, right? And Taylor Michael, Programs Coordinator, for their stewardship and incredible hard work. This program would not have happened without both of them. Thanks to all of Team Book's staff and interns, Meredith Andrews, Andrew Donnelly, Jonathan Kelly, Anya Kuipers, Ali Romero, Madeline Shelton, Jordan Smith, and Meg Tansey. Thanks to our board and book council for showing up in force tonight, and to the Museum The Moving Image for opening their doors and screens to us. Specifically thanks to BJ Hacker for seamless coordination, Sonia Epstein for creative connecting, and Fred Baez for projection assistance. Thanks to Beowulf Sheehan and Seth David Cohen for capturing this evening. Thanks to Lexi Beach, Bari Delberg, and Astoria Bookshop for so kindly supporting the sales of the selected titles, and to Peter Kelly and KG Fair for refreshments and care. And now, tonight's program. I hope we can all create space and a special spirit of celebration for Linda Hogan, who was sadly unable to join us. To ground us in her work, Saeed Jones, author of How We Fight for Our Lives, and our moderator for this evening, will share an excerpt from her collection, The Radiant Lives of Animals. Saeed will be joined on stage by Daisy Hernández, the author of The Kissing Bug, a true story of a family, an insect, and a nation's neglect of a deadly disease, and Rachel Pastan, author of In the Field, who will share readings from their work and then join together in conversation. In brief, these books contemplate gaps in the U.S. healthcare system, humans' relationship to the natural world, and the legacy of a scientist ahead of her time. They tackle the idea of science writing from three wholly unique perspectives, and I feel more in tune with the world around me and what we continue to face during an ongoing pandemic and global crises for having read them. These books are a gift. We're so proud to celebrate them, and I'd love to welcome Daisy Hernández, Rachel Pastan, and Saeed Jones to the stage to allow their work to speak for itself. Thank you so much.
Hello, my queens. Good to be in Queens. And the rest of you. You're welcome. Good to know. Hi. I'm so excited. I think, let's state the obvious. It is a delight to be able to come together to celebrate science and books and just to do it in person. So can we just... It has been a long time and I have missed these celebrations. To get things started, I will read two excerpts from Linda Hogan's wonderful book, The Radiant Lives of Animals. The book combines prose and poetry to explain her relationship to the natural world, and so you'll get two examples of those. Okay. More than a decade ago, 3 mountain lion territories overlapped in our region. A tracker was called in because of the possible danger. 1 lion, perhaps more, vanished after this. For a time, I greatly missed the cats that traveled through the night, slender and gold, leaving behind only a glimpse of eye shine. The population recovered or returned fairly quickly, and those of us who had long lived here listened, once again, to their calls, joined with the many other sounds of the lives around us. We knew them, and knew to go indoors if we heard a mountain lion call out in its sometimes woman screaming or strange cat hissing sounds. At my hidden place, cat calls from the backwoods are eerie and indistinguishable, as are all sounds. The call can't travel a straight line because of the stone walls and geology where rock and hillside cross, moving sound from one place to another. It carries a human voice or an animal cry back and forth until no listener can discern the origin. Still, I know to listen and be silent when a mountain lion announces it is somewhere near. There are nights the screaming sounds assure me something of the wilderness remains here, in spite of the many changes, even though there were fewer of them than in the past. Now, when I drive up my old road and into town, I see the many cut trees,
the mowing of once beautiful mountain grasses before they have even seeded, changes to the environment more familiar and comfortable for suburban residents. One man cut all his ponderosa pines, then mowed a hillside of tall grasses in order to mediate against fire, only to have a hill dry and dead, ready to burn his wood home in a flash. At the time, my own untouched region was still green, moist, and thriving. We need a better education on how to live in this world. Many insurance companies even advise the removal of our necessary ecosystems. Their agents not having stood on earth so hot it will melt their shoes 2 weeks after a fire has passed through. After watching one fire from my windows, I saw how fire moves, leaping from tree to tree, crossing long distances in a flash of light, moving the way a mountain lion moves. Beautiful. And this is the poem Watching Over. This land, I watch over it, the place with ancient stories, the plants of medicine, the place where mountain lions walk down the hill and look in on the light of my life. In this little cabin made of happiness, of stone laid on stone so perfectly 100 years ago, the year before my father was born. The bison is now down in the valley filled with great trees, down near where the quartz shines in veins through dark earth. The fireplace is made of that quartz, some with crystals bright in firelight, and pushed into the mortar, the single baby tooth of the one new child. In this valley of trees and river and crystal, the fault lines of history broke. Now, something always watches over this small cabin, the bison away from its herd, the ghostly wolves that passed outside the door last year, the great hawk flying across, and even the fox that sits each morning and looks in for no other reason than to watch how I live, to make sure it is the right way. Linda Hogan. And now one of our honorees, Rachel Pastan, will read from her novel, In the Field.
Thank you. It is so incredible to be here. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, so I'm going to read to you from my novel, In the Field. I'm going to read you the prologue, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to the National Book Foundation, to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, to the judges for seeing something in this book. It's an honor to be here and to be in a category that includes Daisy Hernández and Linda Hogan. And I want to thank my agent, Gail Hockman, and my editor, Joe Olshan, and my publisher at Delphinium, Laurie Milken, who believed in this book when nobody else did. And finally, I want to thank my parents who are here tonight. My mother, who read draft after draft of this book, and my father, who is a geneticist, who helped me understand the science, and lots of other things too. So, okay. So now I'm going to read to you. Most of this book takes place in the 20s and 30s and 40s, but the prologue takes place later in 1982. In summer at that hour, she would have been out in the cornfield already. Hot green smell of rising stalks, sharp blades of dew-damp leaves, wasps buzzing. But it was October now, and dark. Kate had always been a light sleeper, an early riser, eager for what the day might bring. Often, wakeful and restless, she wandered down to the lab in the heavy stillness of 3 a.m. She kept a cot there among the shelves of microscope slides and back issues of genetics in case she got sleepy and didn't want to bother coming back upstairs. After an hour's doze, she'd wake with her mind clear as though scrubbed, the work waiting. This morning, though, 5:20 by the stove clock, she was upstairs in the apartment kitchen when the phone rang. Drinking coffee in her old seersucker robe, her round steel glasses polished with a carefully pressed handkerchief. She was absorbed in an article about yeast. Some days lately, her mind felt sticky, a swollen door she had to tug open, but today it was working fine. When the phone rang, a loud, bright trill intruding on the humming silence, she glanced at it darkly. What kind of person called at the crack of dawn? Two parallel answers, like two parallel streams of bubbles in an aquarium, bloomed in her gut and rose. But if someone had died, who could it be? Nearly everyone she'd ever loved was dead already. And as for the other, well, it was October. She lifted the heavy, cold receiver to her ear. "Hello," she barked. "Is this Dr. Kathleen Croft?" a male voice said, melodic, affable, vaguely foreign. "I have some very good news." The words clogged and confused her brain. They were like lights stuttering in the darkness and then going out. Then he told her what he called to tell her, her work, an award, recognition. Afterwards, she couldn't remember what he'd said exactly. The old, ghostly voices swirled around her as if trying to drown him out. Her mother's, "It's a waste of money to send a girl to college." Dr. Krause's, "Young women don't take this work seriously." Hiram Cole's, "Science is not something to pass the time with until you get married." The committee had recognized her discovery nearly half a century earlier that genes could move from place to place on the chromosome, something that had come as quite a surprise. Well, that was true enough. But nowhere in the citation was the significance of the discovery mentioned, the true significance that she, leaping from sight to insight, had understood long ago that genes did not absolutely determine what an organism would be. It was as though you celebrated Thomas Edison for making a filament of carbon incandescent without explaining what the thing did. Light up a dark room. Thank you.
And as Daisy makes her way, we're new at this. It's been a minute. I forgot to put my phone on airplane mode. So let's do that together. All those Zoom events spoiled us. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Oh, it's so beautiful to be gathered in person. I also want to thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the National Book Foundation, and thank you to the judges. This just means so much to me. I'm so excited about this program because I'm definitely someone who grew up thinking that there wasn't a place in science for Latina writers, so it's incredible to be here. And I do want to thank Tin House as well, Becky, wherever you are out there. There you are. Thank you so much. It takes so much to make a book and to be here with you tonight. I know many of you understand that. I thought I would read from a part of the book where I decided that I needed to get closer to this parasite. The book is about Chagas disease. It's a parasitic disease, and I feel like I have to explain all of that to you. But anyway, I'm going to jump into the reading about after I made this decision and had an opportunity. The day clouded over as Dr. Kirchhoff and I walked across the University of Iowa campus toward the Eckstein Medical Research Building. It was here that he had worked for so many years with the parasite T. cruzi's DNA. While Dr. Kirchhoff was no longer conducting new research, he kept batches of the parasite on hand to meet federal regulations for the screening test and borrowed lab space from a generous colleague in the building. The laboratory had steel-gray counters, rows of sterilized flasks, and lots of binders stuffed with papers. Dr. Kirchhoff hauled what looked like a styrofoam cooler from the top of a metal shelf and carried it into a room with 2 biosafety cabinets and a table with microscopes. He pulled a flask from the cooler and held it to the light. It looked like it had a shot of bourbon in it. The liquid was a suspension of bovine liver powder and salt, and I could see dots floating in it. The parasite, T. cruzi, millions, alive. Dr. Kirchhoff rocked the flask so the liquid spread. They think they're in the gut of the insect, he told me. In other words, the parasite did not know they were in a flask. They thought they were inside of a kissing bug. These parasites, Dr. Kirchhoff told me, belong to the Tulahen strain, which had been widely studied by scientists conducting research into T. cruzi. It was isolated from a person who had lived in Tulahen, Chile during the 1940s, and it had been maintained in liquid culture all these decades. In other words, I was in a room with the descendants of parasites that had been isolated from someone in South America before my auntie, Theodora, was born. I noticed a flask in the cooler labeled LOL. What does that stand for? Lots of life, he said, matter of fact. He put the flask under the microscope, adjusted the lenses, and after a few seconds, he declared, "This is the best. It's just loaded with parasites." I laughed to avoid feeling the fear in my gut, and I peered into the microscope. At first, I saw a blurry piece of white paper. When my eyes adjusted, I noticed clumps of tangled black hair floating into view. Besides the thin, tangled hair strands, pencil marks stained the screen as if a child had drawn the number 1 sideways, vertically, and diagonally. The more I looked at the field visible through the microscope, the more the flask of parasites reminded me of a cell phone, its screen cracked and scratched. But where were the parasites? "I can't see it," I finally said. Dr. Kirchhoff adjusted the microscope. When I still couldn't make out the parasite, he patiently pulled out his iPhone, took a photo of the flask, then zoomed in. "There," he said, satisfied. "You can see them now." I squinted at the photograph. "Wait, the scratches are the parasites?" I asked, dumbfounded. Dr. Kirchhoff examined the photograph on his phone. He had studied this parasite for much of his professional life. They were as familiar to him as his own fingernails, and I had just told him that the object of his obsession looked like a scratched cell phone screen. "I guess you could say that," he said hesitantly. I returned to the microscope. I focused my eyes on one area of the flask, and this time I could see that the scratch on the glass was thrashing. Its tail or flagellum enabled the parasite to move. I focused on a second scratch, another parasite. This one floated, the movement so incredibly slight it would be easy to miss. I watched a third parasite join a tangle of fine black hair. My vision shifted, and I could see that the clump of fine hair was not a clump at all, but rather a bundle of parasites, their tails vibrating. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Horrifying for those of us who've read it. We'll get into this, right? But like, if you've read Kissing Bug, you understand like that was the equivalent of like coming face to face with one of the raptors in Jurassic Park. Like, terrifying. I want to say first of all, I want to thank the judges for not just picking great books, but books that I think set us up for a great conversation. Because to get us started, I think on one hand we have a nonfiction book about your experience as a woman, as a niece, pulled into a relationship with science because of the Chagas disease, and we'll get to that. And then your book is a book about a scientist, a woman in the 1920s who kind of drives her way into the field of science and fights to stay there. And I was just moved that these books were in conversation in that way. So, but to start, where did these books start for you? They have huge lives, but where did this book first kind of appear in your imagination?
So my novel is based on the life of the real scientist Barbara McClintock, and it's very fictionalized. I make up a lot of stuff, I take a lot of liberties, but the science is basically as right as I could get it. And I first heard of Barbara McClintock, who was a really extraordinary person, when she died, and I read her obituary in the New York Times. And I was completely taken by the story of someone who had this incredible perseverance, who seemed to have sacrificed many different parts of her life, and who had, as well as a brilliant scientific mind, a really open mind to all different kinds of things and ways of knowing. And I cut it out of the newspaper and I put it in a file drawer, and it sat there for 20 years until I was, I had known for a long time I wanted to write a book about women in science. I'm the daughter of a scientist, I'm married to a scientist. I'm not a scientist, but I know a lot of them. And I felt like the stories of the women scientists who I knew were very particular, moving stories. And I really wanted to find a way to talk about, I'm always interested in women in work, but women in science, what that work in particular is like. And I read a lot of different stories, but there's something about McClintock, her sort of, her stubbornness. She was a difficult person. She wasn't an easy person. And I felt that she could not have done the work she did without being difficult. And I loved the way those two things went together. And I just kept coming back to that story.
Beautiful. Yeah, for me, it's interesting to hear you talk about the obituary, because for me, my auntie had Chagas disease, which is a parasitic disease, has been neglected globally for many, many years, decades. And I was actually writing fiction. I was writing a short story, and in the wake of her death, and I realized how little I knew about this disease that had been at the center of our lives. And when I realized that there are 300,000 immigrants in the US, similar to my auntie from South America, from Central America, from Mexico, who have this disease and don't necessarily know about it because that parasite can be dormant in your body for decades, I wanted to know who those families were. I wanted to meet them. I wanted to find out if they had faced some of the same challenges that we had faced with the medical care system. And I like how you described it, being pulled into the story, being pulled into the science, because absolutely I found myself first pulled to find their stories, and then I realized I was actually terrified of insects.
And now I am too. I want you to know that.
So it was quite a journey to suddenly realize, wait, I want to understand this disease. So it became first about meeting other families, and then it was also like trying to understand, how does this parasite work? What's the role of this insect? And I got swept up into it.
It's a beautiful storm to see swept up into. So a question for you, Daisy. Let's put it this way. Writing nonfiction, and you've written nonfiction before. You know this genre. It can be intimidating. There are all kinds of pitfalls and anxieties that we worry about. But let's say this: when you realized, okay, this is the next book I'm really going to devote my time and energy to. What was more intimidating? Writing about science? This book really both interrogates science in terms of health and your own family, but also the globe, or writing about family history, which was a little bit more stressful.
Interesting that you asked, because I was not initially planning to write about my family. I was really thinking that this would only be a work of journalism. And so that was initially very intimidating, until I found out that actually scientists wanted to talk to me. They don't get phone calls from people every day that say, I've been reading all of your papers, I've been following you obsessively. So I was realizing they were very excited, and people were so generous. Doctors, scientists, different experts over the years. So actually, as it went on, it became a little bit less intimidating. But then it was my editor at Tin House who said, what do you think about developing the memoir strand through this book? And that was intimidating, because my auntie and I did not have this beautiful, loving relationship. We had a tumultuous relationship. She did not accept me as being bisexual and coming out to my family and being very out about that. She stopped talking to me for many years. So I realized, this is, sometimes, especially when we talk about illness, we want this mythical patient, this patient who's angelic, who's not actually a real person, right? Not three-dimensional. So it was intimidating to go into that, and also to go into my grief, right? Because part of working on this book was I don't have to grieve, I can work on the book instead, right? But as I worked on the memoir strand, I had to go into that, so that became more intimidating as I went
into it. Oh no, we're in the woods, I hear mountain lions. So, with your novel, I think it's so interesting because, Barbara McClintock was, a successful, incredible scientist and fascinating person in her own right, but you create a fictionalized character. There's so much I want to ask you, both about, how do you research genetics when you realize, you want to write a book? How did you pull that off? But also, how did you make decisions about weaving, details from the real life inspiration and also just honoring that this is a novel and you're going to take your own liberties? How did you navigate science, which is about the truth, and fiction, which is about a different kind of truth?
Yeah, it's interesting because I did try to get the science right and to learn the science as well as I could. And there are two biographies of Barbara McClintock. One that was written in her lifetime by Evelyn Fox Keller, which is an amazing book and a sort of foundational text in women in science, in the field of women in science, in the academy, and then a more recent one, but that was written when she was still alive, and there are a lot of things it didn't say. There were a lot of interesting gaps. And then a more recent book, which deals with her science in a very interesting way, but kind of left her personal life aside. And I was interested in those gaps, and there were a lot of gaps that I could sort of fit myself into and try to imagine. And I did do a lot of research. I went to Cold Spring Harbor, where she worked for many years, and spent about 3 days there and talked to some people who knew her and wandered around the path she would take to the cove and sort of looked up at what I thought was her window, and that was where her cornfield used to be. And then coincidentally, her archives are at the American Philosophical Society, which is in Philadelphia, which is where I live. So I went there and I did archival research there, and they were like, oh, we have boxes and boxes and boxes of photographs of corn and Queen Anne's lace, which she was obsessed with, but she destroyed all of her correspondence before 1973. And it's like, why would you do that? What would the novelist's mind do with that question? And it turned out there were some letters that did survive, just a couple, mostly they weren't that interesting. But I had been, they were like train schedules or whatever, so, and then there were a lot of, but I was, McClintock had a very close friendship with a woman doctor who took care of her when she was younger, and then moved in with that woman and the woman's mother and their parakeets and dogs, and they had a very intense friendship, and it just really was like, but what else is going on there?
Right, like friendship or friendship of course.
Friendship or friendship, and
friendship or friendship.
And McClintock writes about herself and her relationship to her, or talked about herself and her relationship to her body in very interesting ways. And when I was going through these photographs one day in the archive, they were photographs of family, they were all labeled, photographs of her with scientists, they were all labeled. Down towards the bottom of the box, there were these 3 4x6 photographs of a woman, an elegant woman in a sweater and slacks sitting in a field, unlabeled. And I just was like, and who is this person? So I don't know, I don't know, and I don't want to know, I don't need to know what the truth of McClintock's life was, but it was really appealing to me to try to think about a woman who was unconventional in so many ways in her time, and what those intersecting unconventionalities would allow her to do, and how doing work that women weren't doing then for the most part, and having a private life that was unacceptable to be public, how those things might intersect together and permit her to live the kind of extraordinary life that she ultimately did.
Beautiful. And that's beautiful. You're able to respect her boundaries, the things that she wanted us to know we would have known, and so you're able to honor what the real life figure wanted to kind of assert or protect about herself. But by creating a fictional character, maybe we're able to more gently kind of examine those parts of her life. Is that what you think?
Yeah, and definitely needed to fictionalize her to take the kinds of liberties that I wanted to take. Just like dialogue, right? I mean, what did these people say to each other? And how many siblings is too many siblings? And, you know, is it more convenient if her father does then, or, you know, whatever. Yeah, but it was interesting to try to keep the science real, but allow the life to be, to take on different dimensions.
Yeah. I love that. It's so beautiful. Daisy, I'm a Sagittarius. I'm so sorry. Okay, all right. We're both wild enough to understand each other. And so I delighted in the way that, as someone whose brains I'm always kind of hopping and making unexpected connections around, and it seems random, but it makes sense to me. And I think
also a Gemini trait.
Big mood. And I love that you say as a writer, and I love this when authors understand the project, that you own the unexpected twists and turns, where studying the kissing bug and Chagas disease takes you. And there's so many examples. We could talk about Darwin. We could talk about the horrendous racist experiment on that one mental hospital. Can you talk about one example in the book where you were like, I thought I was going to write about my aunt and my disease, and here I am writing about this moment? Was there something that stands out to you?
Yeah, actually, it is the Austin State Hospital. So I did not realize when I started on this book that Chagas disease had been examined in the U.S. So there was a researcher who had been sent down to Texas to see if this disease that had been first identified in Brazil in 1909, if it existed here, because we had the insects and we had known for a long time that the insects were here. And what this researcher proceeded to do was to intentionally infect a young black man who was a patient at this mental hospital. And this is, and then published the results of his racist medical experiment. So it was quite a shock, initially quite a shock to read that, and the fact that you can basically just go online and Google and easily access this article too. It was shocking to me. There's no explanation attached with this article. There's no apology. There's no recognition of what this means, that it still exists in the way it does. The researcher had been celebrated in the pages of the New York Times, actually, for discovering that this parasite, indeed in the U.S., could be transmitted through these insects, as well as was happening in Latin America. And then going into the archives, thanks to many librarians, and looking at some of his correspondence, initially I thought this researcher was working in some kind of isolation. And in fact, he was in intense amounts of communication with Chagas disease experts in South America. They very much knew him. They knew about his work. I don't know explicitly if they knew initially what he was doing, but he published his results, so they knew that and continued to be in contact with him. And then I came across this one letter that just tore me apart, because it was from one of the doctors at the mental hospital. And these people had been thanked in the acknowledgments of that research paper that he published, right? Like, I've carried out this racist medical experiment, and thanks to all these doctors there who helped me, right? Wow. It was incredible. And there was correspondence with one of the doctors there. And that doctor made a reference asking whatever came of that, and he used the word patients in plural, which is the moment where I realized that I had been thinking it was one person, and I couldn't find further evidence that it had been more, but that gave me an indication that it had been more. So I bring that up, and I think that really stayed with me, because I think oftentimes we think of Tuskegee, right? But here is a racist medical experiment that was carried out that I can't believe that word never got out, that the staff would have known what was going on, that like his family might have known. So, I believe that kind of knowledge does get transmitted in ways that are not necessarily documented. So that was, that was something that really shook me up in the process of research.
Ooh, it was incredible. It's like another, of course, I think you learn about something like Tuskegee, and I think if we are honest with ourselves about how our country works, of course there would be other similar experiments, right? But we still, so thank you for shedding light on that. Rachel, I guess I want to ask for people, because I believed you were a scientist when I was reading this. I need to make it very clear. I thought you were like Brandon Taylor. I was like, surely she at least got like her master's degree or something. You know what I mean? Because you write, just to write fiction is hard enough, but to write, in the life, the mind of someone just who is a specialist, literally, is going to win a huge award because she's that deep in the field, is hard to pull off. For someone in the audience who might be intimidated by the sciences, they're interested, they think of themselves as a student of the sciences, but the idea of actually writing a book that goes as far as your book goes, what would you say? What kind, do you have a bit of like advice or encouragement about like maybe where to begin? Because I think it can seem, intimidating. I'll ask you that too, Daisy.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I don't know what my answer to that question is, because I feel like, so at the beginning when I started doing the research, I actually asked my dad, who, as I said, is a geneticist, if he thought I could learn the genetics, and he was like, oh yeah, of course you can. And then I started to try to learn it, and I was like, oh no, this is really hard. And there was actually a wonderful science librarian at Swarthmore College, which is in the town where I live, Meg Spencer, who helped me find like science textbooks that they would have used in the 1920s when McClintock would have been in school. And there's and I have chapters where she's like in biology class in college, and like I could learn that because it was like 100 years ago. Science genetics. I tried reading college textbooks about genetics today.
You're like, I would have been a straight A student a century ago.
So I don't know. I think it's really hard. I don't know what it's getting into, but I think that finding the connections between, what happens in the laboratory and then what happens in nature, and then what happens in the lives of the humans who are doing the science, that following that thread was what, and going back and forth sort of, was what made it possible for me to go back and learn. Like I had to learn the science, and then I would write some things and then I would forget, and then I would go back to revise and I would be like, wait, I don't remember anymore, and then I'd have to learn it again 3 times. So, but McClintock studied corn, and she was amazing with a microscope, and she really did seem to have this ability to see things on the slide that other people couldn't see. She invented techniques to see things too that were new techniques, but it was always connected to her for the organism in the field. And she, unlike other corn scientists, corn was a big deal at the time. All the geneticists were studying corn. They had these big fields, and you knew the raccoons would get some, and you knew the crows would get some. And she was like, no, I have a small field. I know every plant. I don't let other people do the fertilizing because they might make a mistake. I do my own fertilizing. I work really hard to keep the crows away because I can't lose any plants. And there's a scene in the novel that I did take from life where there's a big rainstorm, and everyone else's corn gets washed away, and she goes out with her car and she shines, it's the middle of the night, and she shines her headlights on the rows of corn, and she's shoring up the plants with dirt because she's like, I cannot lose these plants. And so that connection between what happened in the laboratory and then these plants, which were so, not alive to her in a sentimental way, but alive to her as plants, and she knew, she could tell each one, and then, and then her in the laboratory putting all the things together. So I felt like through the human and through the nature, I could get to the laboratory, and as a non-scientist myself, that enabled me to be there and do that work.
Deeply human. The scene with her in the rainstorm is just incredible. So yeah, I love it. So Daisy, you mentioned reporting very much informed the book, but is that the tip you would tell someone to go on?
Well, first I would say to be really connected with what your purpose is in working on the book, because I feel like that really got me through a lot of the science and it really introduced me. So I think for me it was helpful to first know that I wanted to meet families who had been impacted by this disease, and once I started meeting those families, that really made my purpose even clearer. That it was astonishing to me that no book existed on this disease when millions are infected in the Americas. An estimated 6 million when you consider Latin America. And so I think having that sense of purpose, you know, made me very persistent where I might have given up. But we're so lucky to have so many incredible science writers. So I would say also, like, aside from having a strong sense of purpose, is looking into the work of science writers that you're really drawn to. So I heard Carl Zimmerman mentioned earlier, love his books. I read Sonia Shah's book on malaria, Mary Roach, Rebecca Skloot. I just really immersed myself in the work of these science writers to see, how they were working with language. And what really impressed me and has stayed with me is that it's really translation work. That's what you're doing. You're translating the language of this field for those who don't work in that field. And so, that made a huge impact. We're so lucky to have so many amazing science writers.
It's beautiful. And I do, again, have to celebrate that in both your books. You're both such deeply humane, humanizing people, and that shows up in your writing, and so maybe that's part of it too. It's not like science is this huge field. It's like these are stories about people, and follow them, and I think that really transformed the reading experience because I could feel that spirit from both of you. I wanted you, your aunt was so fascinating for so many reasons, and actually, there's kind of a similarity, I think, between Kate and Tia. This steeliness. Are you gonna make time signal? Close? Oh, we're good. Okay. But I wanted to ask how you used recordings, because I thought that was actually pretty special. It's like correspondence, reporting, but you actually have, I guess, audio recordings, right?
I do. So my auntie came to the U.S. In 1980, and at that point we didn't have WhatsApp. So she would do these cassette recordings for her to send back to her mother instead of letters, and so they survived. And so I have her narrating for her mother her experience of being diagnosed with Chagas disease. She was lucky enough to find a doctor who treated patients, indigent patients who didn't have medical resources at what was then Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. And so she narrated her surgery, her diagnosis, her surgeries, her relationships with different doctors. And it's incredible. It is really incredible to have her actual voice from those years to work with. So I actually did bring that into the book as well.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. It could be 9 o'clock for all I know. Okay, one more question for the two of you. This is something I ask people often. These books were big. Every book is an undertaking, but these books felt like undertakings, very ambitious, and I commend that again. What did the process of writing these books do to you? What is something you understand deeply about yourselves or the world that came from the process of writing and researching these books?
You can go first. So I've published 4 novels, and they all turn out to be about the same thing, which is about women and work and family, or work and intimacy. And I guess what I learned was I still don't understand how to think about women and work and intimacy. It comes out different all the time, and so. But I guess that's the central question. I mean, I think it's a central question for our time, and I think it's a central question for me in a deeply personal way, even though I should have figured it out by now. That it's really cool when you can find a way to take the questions that really interest you and that you think are important to the world. And put them in a story. That's what I want to do. So I guess that's what I learned about myself.
I'm glad you do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, I spent years talking to these amazing doctors who have tried to raise awareness in the U.S. about this disease. And I also spent years talking to scientists who have devoted their lives, to understanding these insects and this parasite, and I just was so moved by the kind of work that they are doing. And I feel like for me in the process, I really came to appreciate that writing a book is my way of working in medicine, that books can be medicine, that it has to be. It's there was a moment I think where I was why didn't I go to medical school? Why didn't I get my PhD in science? I could be doing something significant. And it was really important for me to have that moment of wait, they're doing their amazing work, and my amazing work is to write this book and to get, what they're doing out to a different kind of audience than the ones that they themselves are reaching. And I think just that shift in terms of realizing that, like, books have been medicine for me, right? And now I get to create medicine for others. That was a really important moment for me.
We all need to be doing that work. Well, I think we'll leave it there for now. Can we give it up again for Linda Hogan as well, Daisy Hernández, Rachel Pastan, incredible. Thank you all for being here tonight. Thank you to the National Book Foundation and the Sloan Foundation. Thank you guys. This is great.